About 1 in 3 Americans between 18 and 34 years old live with their parents.
And while you may have heard more about this recently, this trend isn't new.
Between 2005 and 2015, the share just grew very steeply over this 10-year period. Since then, it's been fairly stable. There was an uptick, of course, during the pandemic. In the wake of the pandemic, those rates of parental co-residence are now about where they were right before. Part of the reason.
Okay, so if we look at this graph right here, at this age range, I believe it is easier for women to move in with a partner than for a man because women usually date men that are like older and therefore more established versus as a man, you'll be expected to carry the weight of, say, providing for the family, and young men just aren't at the point where they can reliably do that. So.
Pandemic, those rates of parental co-residence are now about where they were right before. Part of the reason we see this escalation of young adults not leaving the nest or returning to the nest is this idea that it was harder and harder for them to weather shocks.
Nearly 30% of Gen Z said they would like to save but don't make enough money. And roughly 2 in 5 millennials and Gen Z adults feel it's harder to build financial wealth now than when their parents were their age because of the economy. 27-year-old Victoria Franklin has been living with her mother in New Jersey since she graduated college in 2019.
I saw all of the money that I was saving and I thought maybe I should stay home for a little bit, and I didn't feel an urgency to move out.
Not everyone is enthusiastic about this trend.
You guys are making 6 figures together. You can't tell me you can't afford a house. They just don't want to spend their money.
Told ya.
36% of Americans said in a 2022 survey that more young adults living with their parents is bad for society. So here's why young Americans are choosing to live with their parents and what the implications are for the U.S. economy.
I know where I live, they're building apartments out of the wazoo. So I don't think BlackRock and these other large security firms are doing perfectly fine. They're going to do perfectly fine regardless of if young people are buying homes or living with their parents or not, because their greedy little hands are involved in so many important sectors.
My name is Victoria Franklin. I am 27 years old and I live in my childhood home with my mother and my boyfriend.
Victoria graduated from the University of Miami in 2019 and moved in with her mom when she was looking for a job.
After I saw the cost of living and things like that after I graduated, that maybe I'd be home for about a year.
More than half of Gen Z adults say they don't make enough money to live the life they want due to high cost of living.
I ended up bartending and waitressing until October, where I got my first offer, so it did take a little bit longer than I expected. Currently live at the Jersey Shore, and I was commuting into New York City, which takes about 2 hours each way. And I thought, in 6 months or so, I'll move into the city, be closer to the job, and the pandemic threw a wrench in those plans.
Victoria now works a fully remote job, which she says she probably wouldn't have if it weren't for the pandemic. Without a commute to worry about, she was able to stay at her mom's for longer.
It's a lot harder for young people today to save up for, markers of the American dream than it was for previous generations. Part of the reason we see this escalation of young adults not leaving the nest or returning to the nest is this idea that it was harder and harder for them to weather shocks. And so
I'm not sure how much of this you can contribute to the pandemic, but I know for a fact entry-level jobs are not outpacing inflation. As long as inflation is running wild, that dollar that you make is literally worth less than it was when you earned it. A big part of this is due to the federal government quite literally printing money at a pace we have never seen before.
For example, if they suffered a layoff or they suffer some sort of health shock or they weather shocks. And so, for example, if they suffered a layoff or they suffer some sort of health shock or they got in a car accident, if they didn't have any additional credit to weather that shock, they would end up moving back home. The financial stability of young adults, their ability to pay for things if they got into an emergency, was one of the big factors influencing whether or not they were living on their own or living with their parents.
A significant number of Gen Z adults and millennials lack emergency savings. In fact, 46% of millennials and 32% of Gen Z have more credit card debt than emergency savings.
This can have ramifications for setting up a financial future.
Roughly 1 in 4 Gen Z adults say housing costs are
The reason for markers of the American dream than it was for previous generations. Part of the reason we see this escalation of young adults not leaving the nest or returning to the nest is this idea that it was harder and harder for them to weather shocks. And so, for example, if they suffered a layoff or they suffer some sort of health shock or they got in a car accident, if they didn't have any additional credit to weather that shock, they would end up moving back home.
It's kind of like when you get in your car, you're trying to start it, and you hear a noise and it triggers an instant panic attack. That's where these young people are at right now.
The financial stability of young adults, their ability to pay for things if they got into an emergency, was one of the big factors influencing whether or not they were living on their own or living with their parents.
A significant number of Gen Z adults and millennials lack emergency savings. In fact, 46% of millennials and 32% of Gen Z have more credit card debt than emergency savings.
This can have ramifications for setting up a financial future.
Roughly 1 in 4 Gen Z adults say housing costs are one of the biggest challenges to financial success.
The prices of homes has escalated over the last few decades much faster than actual incomes. So it is actually much harder for a millennial or a Gen Z to save up for a down payment to buy a home. And that's something that bears out in the data.
The pandemic did have a lot to do with it. I saw how much I was saving and I was like, maybe I shouldn't be paying, upwards of $3,000 a month and making somebody else richer when I could stay at home, save that money, and spend it on where I want to spend it. Between my job and my bartending and waitressing, I make anywhere from $85,000 to $95,000 a year. I would say about 40 to 50% of my salary is going right into savings. My mentality is, why rent and give my money to someone else when I can start to own? And so a big chunk of that money is going to go towards a town.
Yeah, why give your money to BlackRock and when you can just give it to yourself? Right?
Payment on a house.
Young adults ages 25 to 34 in high cost of living areas are more likely to live with their parents. Nearly 26% of young adults in New Jersey were living with at least one of their parents in 2022. The median household income in Oceanport, New Jersey, where the Franklins live, was nearly $133,000 in 2022, while the median value of a home in the region was around $644,000.
My dad built this house for $350,000 and was making probably $10,000 to $15,000 less than I was. My mom wasn't working at the time, and they were able to afford a $350,000 house on a $70,000 a year salary with a son. And that's not even the American dream anymore. That's not even possible. My aunt, who I fight with all the time, is always saying how you have to give somewhere, right?
Yeah, times have changed significantly. She's absolutely correct. This is only possible for the privileged kids who work hard, wake up early, and oh yeah, whose dad owns the company. That's not happening for people that are regular people.
And my cousin said something to her the other day and said, we're giving everywhere. We don't get property. We don't get good school systems. Whatever we're trading off is too much to trade off.
Victoria had brought up some conflict with her aunt a few times.
Oh, this is my Aunt Judy.
So I asked Aunt Judy to come on over and talk to us.
I talked about how much we fight about millennials, yes, but millennials living at home, and how you always say, well, you have to sacrifice something, but how much we're sacrificing. We don't get like a big property, or we don't get like a nice house, or it's not in a good school system.
But you have to start somewhere. You have to start anywhere. Just start your portfolio is what I told you. I don't care what it is. You don't have to live in Oceanport your first time.
No, but you were able to live in Oceanport the first time.
Okay, I guess it was different times.
Gen X and baby boomers may have a tougher time understanding what young adults are going through today because they enjoyed, until the pandemic recession hit, a solid almost 15 years of uninterrupted economic expansion. Baby boomers, Gen X, they weathered many economic downturns, including major recessions. But I think the big difference is that when they were starting to form their own households and starting to accumulate wealth, housing.
Yeah, maybe Gen Z should have just bought a house in the 90s when they were in Pampers and Netflix and Amazon stock when it was $10 a share when they were in kindergarten. It's not because they're not working hard. It's because the opportunities older generations were afforded are no longer there. They've disappeared.
and higher ed were both more affordable relative to their incomes than they are now.
When I started out, I was making $35,000 a year. That was nothing. And he was making $35,000 a year. You guys are making six figures together. You can't tell me you can't afford
I'm not sure if they're acting or not, but I mean, we all know six figures is not what it used to be. That's a fact.
a house. They just don't want to spend their money.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't know.
Did you want it? What was my first house? 250 maybe? 270?
That doesn't exist anymore. Where am I finding a $270,000
I'm
house?
not making $35,000 a year. Combined, we made 70.
In 1995, $70,000 was the equivalent of $145,000 today.
Yeah, look at that. See?
We do also have a situation that what is really good for an individual person or an individual family is not necessarily good for the entire macroeconomy.
The Federal Reserve estimates in a 2019 paper that young adults who move out of their parents' house would spend around $13,000 more per year on things such as housing, food, and transportation.
One of the big boosts to consumer spending is when people form households. Whether you're a renter or a buyer, you need to furnish that house. You need to fix things up in the home to make it livable. You end up spending a lot of money during that time. So if the pace of household formation slows down, then that's going to slow down the pace of consumer spending, and that will produce a drag on the economy.
Another issue is that there aren't enough affordable properties in popular areas for younger people who are in entry-level jobs and making less money.
Any sort of housing policy needs to be multi-pronged. Are there homes that are at the price point of these prospective home buyers? What can we do to
I have the answer to that. No.
increase the housing supply? What can we do to build? What can we do to help elder Americans, to help them downsize and move into more right-sized homes that will open up larger homes for young families? And so I think one alone is not really going to do it. We've got to look both at demand as well as supply.
The other major factor here is how much student loan debt young Americans have. 59% of U.S. adults say they've delayed financial milestones because of their student debt.
I do have a student loan payment. It's about $480 a month. So that's my largest expense.
The liability could be worse for Black borrowers, who tend to have higher than average student loan debt and less wealth than white counterparts. Black and Hispanic respondents were more likely to say that debt was holding them back from reaching financial milestones. Less than half of white respondents said the same.
The amount of debt young adults held also rose substantially between 2005 and 2014, during that period of strong escalation in that cohort living with their parents.
Aggregate student loans are such an enormous part of the economy now, and that's not a reflection of younger people making bad choices with.
This is what happens when you turn education into a business that is more focused on expanding its administration instead of providing a quality education to students.
Their education, it's really a consequence in large part due to the fact that there's less public funding and going to college just is more expensive.
Yeah, going to college, somehow the cost of education is going up, yet the value of it is going down.
Which makes it even harder for even those college grads who are hoping to get earning more money as a result of their college degrees.
Student loan debt by itself can't explain the phenomenon, especially considering so many European countries with much less student loan debt have higher rates of young adults living with their parents.
24 out of 29 European countries had more 18 to 34-year-olds living with their parents in 2020.
You guys might not know this, but households where younger generations are expected to care for like older generations is more common in parts of the world outside of the United States. In America, that's just that. I'm not sure if America's ever been like that. Like I think parents in America expect you to move out at 18.
Than the US. It was over 70% in Italy, Portugal, Greece, Serbia, and Croatia.
My boyfriend is Brazilian, and multi-generational homes are very common in almost everywhere else in the world, except in the United States. So I'm just taking a page of their playbook.
The Americans are probably the only people that they're not multi-generations in one house. And I don't have a problem with it. I mean, I think it's kind of nice. Why do we have to be so cold to push everybody out?
You know, there are a lot of cultures out there in which it is normal to live with your parents until you get married.
Okay, we're gonna finish this one up, guys. Help me get to 1,000 subscribers and tune into my Twitch most evenings around 6 Eastern for more reactions and gaming content. You guys can watch me live and we can chat or whatever. really appreciate that.
And I don't think there's necessarily an economic explanation for that.
The Franklins would say in the US, it is the economy, but Victoria's mom is kind of okay with it.
Unfortunately, it is the economy and the world that we live in that just doesn't allow them to go live a comfortable life. So with them living here was no big deal. It's not really a problem. They're saving their money. Eventually they'll buy a house, and that works.